It is one of the most instantly recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music. It is the sonic distillation of California sunshine, a shimmering, psychedelic dream of endless summers and youthful romance. It sounds effortless. It sounds like joy captured in a bottle. But the truth is, this 3-minute and 35-second pop song was the single most difficult, expensive, and obsessive recording project of the 1960s. It was not born from a casual jam session on the beach. It was clawed out of the ether, piece by agonizing piece, in dark, smoke-filled recording studios over the course of 7 grueling months. To understand Good Vibrations, you have to understand the man who dreamed it into existence at the absolute precipice of his sanity. This is the story of Brian Wilson in 1966. It is the story of a 23-year-old musical genius who was trapped by his own unprecedented success, trapped by the expectations of his band and his record label, and trapped inside a mind that was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own creativity. By the beginning of 1966, the Beach Boys were the defining sound of America. They were the clean-cut, striped-shirted ambassadors of surf and cars. But Brian Wilson, the architect of that sound, had already retreated from the world. A severe panic attack on a flight to Houston in December 1964 had convinced him that the road was killing him. He made a fateful decision. The rest of the band, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, would tour the world, performing the hits. Brian would stay home in Los Angeles. His job was to write the future. While his brothers and cousins were playing state fairs in the Midwest, Brian was locked inside Hollywood recording studios, treating them as his own personal laboratory. He was no longer interested in surfboards and hot rods. He was engaged in a high-stakes transatlantic musical arms race with the Beatles. He had heard Rubber Soul and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He responded with Pet Sounds, an album of achingly beautiful, introspective Baroque pop that is now considered a masterpiece. But Pet Sounds, for all its artistic brilliance, was a commercial disappointment in America. The record label, Capitol, didn't get it. Mike Love, the band's frontman, famously hated it, worrying that Brian was messing with their winning formula. "Who's gonna hear this stuff?" he reportedly asked. "The ears of a dog?" Brian was crushed, but he was also defiant. He knew he had touched something profound in Pet Sounds, something that went beyond mere pop music. He felt he was on the verge of a divine breakthrough. He wanted to create a music that was spiritual, music that you could feel as much as hear. He had a concept in his head. He didn't want to write a standard song with a verse, a chorus, and a bridge, played from start to finish by a band in a room. He imagined a song that was alive, a piece of music that shifted textures and moods, uncontrollably, like a kaleidoscope. He wanted to create what publicist Derek Taylor would later famously christen a pocket symphony. He had a title, inspired by his mother telling him as a child that dogs would bark at people with bad vibrations. He wanted to write a song about the opposite, about an invisible cosmic energy that connected people. In February of 1966, while the rest of the band was in Japan, Brian Wilson walked into Gold Star Studios in Hollywood. He didn't have a finished song. He didn't even have lyrics. He just had a feel, a fragment of a musical idea in his head. He had the absolute best session musicians in the world waiting for his command, and an unlimited budget. He was about to embark on the most ambitious recording project in rock history. He was about to push the boundaries of the recording studio until they broke, and in the process, he would nearly break himself. When Brian Wilson walked into the studio in 1966, He didn't act like a band leader. He acted like a film director. In traditional recording, a band would rehearse a song, set up their gear, and play it from start to finish until they got a master take. It was a performance captured in real time. But Brian Wilson had abandoned reality. He wasn't interested in documenting a performance. He was interested in constructing a sonic fantasy that existed only in his mind. To achieve this, he invented a radical new method of recording, something he called modular recording. He treated the song not as a linear narrative, but as a collection of distinct, separate feels or movements. He would record a verse in one studio to get a specific drum sound. He would record the chorus in a different studio weeks later to capture a specific echo. He would record the bridge in a third studio. He wasn't building a house. He was painting a mosaic, tile by agonizing tile. For the musicians, the legendary Wrecking Crew, that elite squadron of session players who had built the wall of sound for Phil Spector, working with Brian was a bizarre, lucrative, and exhausting privilege. They adored him, but they also feared his ear. Brian could hear things no one else could. He could hear if a tambourine was a fraction of a second late. He could hear if a cello was slightly out of tune with a guitar. And the instrumentation he demanded was unheard of in pop music. For good vibrations, he didn't just want guitars and drums. He wanted cellos playing rapid, chugging triplets, a sound usually reserved for classical symphonies, now being used to drive a rock beat. He wanted a jaw harp, a twangy folk instrument, to provide a rhythmic undercurrent. He wanted clarinets, upright bass, and Hammond organ. But the crowning touch, the sound that would define the song and the era, was a strange, box-like instrument called the Electro-Theremin. The traditional theremin was a spooky instrument used in 1950s sci-fi movies to signal the arrival of aliens or monsters. It was played by waving one's hands in the air through electromagnetic fields. It was notoriously difficult to play in tune. But Brian had found a man named Paul Tanner, a former trombonist for Glenn Miller, who had invented a version that was easier to control, played with a mechanical slide. Brian wanted that sound. He wanted that high, wavering, ghostly wail, but he didn't want it to be scary. He wanted it to be beautiful. He wanted it to sound like a celestial choir, like the vibration of the universe itself. Picture the scene. Studio 3 at Western Recorders. It is the middle of the night. The room is thick with cigarette smoke. A dozen hardened session musicians, men who have played on Sinatra records and jazz standards, are waiting. And there is Brian Wilson, a 23-year-old in loafers and a striped shirt, conducting them. He doesn't have a baton. He uses his hands, his body, waving his arms, closing his eyes, chasing a sound that only he can hear. He creates Module A, the verse. It's spooky, driven by that chugging cello and a sparse bass line from Carol Kaye. It takes hours to get the drum sound right. Then, weeks later, he creates Module B, the chorus. This is the explosion of joy, the I'm picking up good vibrations section. It is a wall of sound, a dense layer of vocals and organ. Then Module C, the bridge, a slow, soulful, almost religious section, with a harmonica and a pounding piano. He recorded over 90 hours of tape. He used 4 different major studios in Los Angeles, Gold Star, Columbia, Western, and Sunset Sound, chasing the specific acoustic properties of each room. He spent an estimated $50,000 on this one single song. In today's money, that is roughly $500,000 for one song. The record executives at Capitol were terrified. They saw the bills piling up. They saw the release date slipping. They saw their golden boy, the goose who laid the golden eggs, spending weeks on a 10-second section of music. They wanted Surfin' USA Part 2. They wanted cars and girls. Instead, Brian was giving them a pocket symphony that required a diagram to understand. But Brian was unconcerned with budgets or deadlines. He was in a race against his own mind. He felt a pressure that no one else could see. He believed he was a conduit for something greater. He famously had a sandbox installed in his dining room, placing his grand piano right in the middle of it, so he could feel the sand between his toes while he wrote, trying to stay connected to the beach he was no longer writing about. As the months dragged on, the song became a rumor, a legend before it was even finished. The Good Vibrations sessions were becoming the stuff of industry gossip. Was Brian Wilson crazy? Or was he creating the greatest record ever made? The answer, it turned out, was yes. By the late summer of 1966, Brian Wilson had his modules. He had reels and reels of magnetic tape containing the most expensive and complex instrumental tracks ever recorded for a pop song. He had the cello triplets, the theremin wail, the fuzz bass, and the tack piano. He had the feels. But a song is not just a collection of sounds. It needs a voice. And for Good Vibrations, Brian didn't need just any voice. He needed the specific genetic blend of his own family. He needed the Beach Boys. When the rest of the band returned from their grueling tour of Japan and the US, they were exhausted. They had spent months playing Surfin' USA and I Get Around to screaming arenas. They walked into the studio expecting to knock out another catchy single in a few hours. Instead, they walked into Brian's labyrinth. The friction was immediate. Mike Love, the band's lead singer and lyricist, was the guardian of the Beach Boys formula. He understood cars, girls, and surfing. He understood what the fans wanted. When he heard the instrumental tracks for Good Vibrations, with their shifting tempos and strange classical textures, he was baffled. He famously called it avant-garde sht. He worried it would alienate their core audience. He looked at the lyrics Brian had been working on with guest lyricist Tony Asher, lyrics that were abstract and spiritual, and he pushed back. Mike Love wanted lyrics that grounded the song. He wanted to sing about a girl. He wrote the opening lines. I love the colorful clothes she wears, and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair. It was a compromise, a tether to the pop world that Brian was rapidly floating away from. But once the lyrics were settled, the real work began. The vocal sessions for Good Vibrations were even more grueling than the instrumental ones. Brian treated the band's voices exactly as he had treated the session musicians, as instruments to be manipulated, layered, and perfected. He didn't want a standard three-part harmony. He wanted a choir. He wanted a rock and roll Gregorian chant. He worked them to the bone. He would have them sing the same phrase over and over again for hours, searching for a specific tonal quality. He stacked the harmonies deeper than he ever had before. In the chorus, good, 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 good vibrations, he created a dense, vibrating wall of sound that felt like it was physically surrounding the listener. The bass vocal part, sung by Mike Love, I'm Picking Up Good Vibrations, was designed to lock in with the cello rhythm, creating a propulsive, chugging bottom end that was unlike anything on the radio. Then there was the prayer section. This was the slow, organ-heavy bridge where the beat drops out. Brian wanted it to sound like a church service in outer space. He coached his younger brother, Carl Wilson, to deliver a vocal performance of aching purity. Carl, who was rapidly becoming the band's most soulful singer, delivered the lines, I don't know where, but she sends me there, with a mixture of reverence and ecstasy that anchored the entire chaotic swirl of the song. And soaring over it all was Brian's own falsetto, a sound of pure, fragile beauty. In these sessions, you can hear the absolute peak of the Beach Boys as a vocal unit. Despite the infighting, despite the exhaustion, despite Mike Love's skepticism, when they stood around that microphone, they were magic. They were family. They breathed together. Brian knew how to dial into their specific timbres and create a sound that was greater than the sum of its parts. These sessions stretched on for weeks. The band members were frustrated. They were used to recording an entire album in the time it was taking to record this one song. But Brian was relentless. He was chasing a sound in his head, a teenage symphony to God, and he wouldn't stop until the tape matched the hallucination. Finally, in September 1966, the recording was done. But the song wasn't. Brian Wilson sat in the control room at Columbia Studios with a pile of tapes. He had the verse from one studio, the chorus from another, the bridge from a third. They were in different keys. They had different ambient sounds. Now, he had to perform the final magic trick. He had to assemble the mosaic. In the era before digital editing, before Pro Tools, this meant physically cutting the master tape with a razor blade and taping it back together. It was a high-wire act. One slip of the hand, and a $50,000 recording could be ruined. Brian, working with his engineers, began to splice. He cut the tape. He moved sections around. He shortened the verses. He extended the fade-out. He was editing music like film. The transitions between the sections, where the cello-driven verse suddenly snaps into the organ-drenched chorus, are sharp, jarring, and thrilling. They shouldn't work. The tempo changes. The texture changes, but Brian glued them together with such precision that the shifts felt not like mistakes, but like sudden rushes of adrenaline. The final mix was a mono masterpiece. Brian famously hated stereo. He was deaf in one ear, result of a childhood injury, so he couldn't hear stereo. He mixed for AM radio, for the single speaker in a car dashboard. He compressed the sound until it was a solid diamond of audio information. When he finally played the finished acetate for the band and the executives at Capitol Records, the silence in the room was heavy. They had been terrified of the cost. They had been terrified of the weird instruments. But as the final theremin wail faded out, they knew. They didn't just have a hit. They had a landmark. Good Vibrations was released as a single on October 10, 1966. It was an immediate seismic event. It shot to number 1 in the US and the UK. It sold over 1 million copies. It was nominated for 4 Grammys. But the commercial success was only half the story. The critical reaction was one of awe. Musicians, critics, and fans realized that the rules had changed. A pop song didn't have to be a simple verse-chorus structure. It could be abstract. It could be complex. It could use cellos and theremins and still be catchy. Across the Atlantic, the Beatles were listening. Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who were in the midst of their own studio experimentation, reportedly pulled their cars over to the side of the road when they first heard it. It terrified them. It inspired them. It is widely acknowledged that Good Vibrations was the primary catalyst for Strawberry Fields Forever and A Day in the Life. Brian Wilson had thrown down the gauntlet. He had proven that the recording studio was an instrument, and he was its virtuoso. For a brief shining moment in late 1966, Brian Wilson was the undisputed king of pop music. He had out-Beatled the Beatles. He had taken the sounds in his head, the sounds of prayer, of surf, of joy, of fear, and he had successfully transmitted them to the world. He was a genius at the absolute height of his powers. But the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. And Brian was standing on a precipice. Good Vibrations was a triumph, but it was also a trap. He had spent 6 months and a fortune on one song. Now the world asked the inevitable, crushing question: what's next? Brian's answer was to be an album called Smile. He wanted to take the modular, symphonic approach of Good Vibrations and apply it to an entire LP. He wanted to write a teenage symphony that would surpass Pet Sounds, surpass Good Vibrations, and surpass God himself. He didn't know it yet, but Good Vibrations wasn't just the peak. It was the end of the era. The pressure to top his own masterpiece would prove to be too much. The delicate balance of his mind, already strained by the obsessive production of this pocket symphony, was about to give way. The vibrations were good, but the cost was catastrophic. The release of Good Vibrations was not just a high watermark, it was a dam breaking. The song was a colossal success, a #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic, hailed by critics as a quantum leap in musical evolution. Brian Wilson was crowned the Mozart of rock and roll. He was 24 years old. But in the rarefied air of 1966, success was a double-edged sword. With Good Vibrations, Brian had proven that his modular method worked. He had proven that you could spend 6 months and a fortune on a single track and create art that was also commercially dominant. He had validated his own madness. And now, the world, the label, and the band asked the inevitable, crushing question: what's next? Brian's answer was Smile. If Good Vibrations was a pocket symphony, Smile was intended to be the whole opera. It was meant to be a teenage symphony to God, an album constructed entirely using the modular techniques of Good Vibrations. Brian envisioned a musical journey across America, a psychedelic trip through history, humor, and the elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. But the avalanche of expectation was too heavy. The Good Vibrations sessions had been grueling, but they had produced a single, perfect jewel. Applying that same obsessive, expensive, and time-consuming process to an entire album began to tear the fabric of Brian's reality apart. The recording sessions for Smile became the stuff of dark legend. The eccentricity that had birthed Good Vibrations hardened into paranoia. Brian held meetings in his swimming pool. He famously turned his dining room into a sandbox, filling it with 8 tons of beach sand so he could feel the ocean while he played his piano. He built a tent in his living room to smoke hashish in. The music became increasingly abstract. He recorded the fire section, intended for the track Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, demanding the musicians wear fire helmets. He had a bucket of burning wood in the studio to create the smell of smoke. When a building burned down the street from the studio shortly after the session, Brian became convinced that his music had caused the fire. He destroyed the tapes in a fit of terrified superstition. The friction with the band, specifically Mike Love, escalated from skepticism to open warfare. Good Vibrations had been a hit, yes, but it had taken 6 months. Now Brian was spending months recording sounds of vegetables being chewed for the song Vegetables, and strange, disjointed fragments of Americana. Love famously demanded, "Don't F with the formula." He looked at the abstract lyrics provided by Brian's new collaborator, Van Dyke Parks, and sneered, "What does over and over the crow cries uncover the cornfield mean?" Brian couldn't explain it. He could only hear it, but the support system that had held him up during Good Vibrations was collapsing. The wrecking crew was still there, faithful and professional, but Brian's internal compass was spinning wildly. He was consuming massive amounts of food, drugs, and praise, but he was starving for stability. The coup de grace came from across the ocean. In 1967, the Beatles released Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. Brian heard them on his car radio. He pulled over and wept. "They got there first," he reportedly said. He felt that the Beatles had taken the baton he passed with Good Vibrations and run further and faster than he could. When Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released later that year, Brian felt defeated. The race was over. The avalanche buried him. In May 1967, the Smile Project was officially abandoned. The Teenage Symphony to God was shelved, becoming the most famous unreleased album in history. Brian Wilson retreated into his bedroom, into his bed, and into a dark, decades-long fog of mental illness and medication. The band, desperate for product, released a watered-down, lo-fi version of the tracks called Smiley Smile in late 1967. It was a bizarre, stoned, minimalist shadow of the grandeur Brian had intended. It confused fans. It flopped in the U.S. The Beach Boys, once the vanguard of the future, were suddenly viewed as archaic leftovers of a bygone era. They became a nostalgia act, touring the old hits, while their genius leader became a ghost in his own mansion. Good Vibrations stood alone. It was a monolith. It was the peak of the mountain, but the path leading up to it had crumbled, leaving Brian stranded at the summit, unable to come down. For decades, Good Vibrations existed as a dazzling anomaly. It was the single greatest achievement of the 1960s studio era, yet it marked the end of the Beach Boys' relevance as a contemporary creative force. It was a monument to what was possible, and a tombstone for what was lost. But the song's legacy continued to vibrate through the culture, influencing generations of musicians in ways that Brian Wilson could never have imagined from his secluded bedroom. Technically, Good Vibrations invented the modern recording studio aesthetic. Before Brian, the studio was a place to capture a performance. After Brian, the studio was an instrument. His use of the mixing board as a compositional tool paved the way for everything from Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon to the dense, layered productions of Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. His modular editing technique, cutting and pasting different sections to create a new whole, was a direct precursor to hip-hop sampling and modern digital editing. Brian was making beats and looping sections with razor blades and sticky tape 20 years before the invention of the sampler. Every producer who sits in front of a computer screen today, dragging and dropping blocks of sound to build a track, is walking in the footsteps of Brian Wilson in 1966. Musically, the song broke down the walls between pop and classical. It proved that a 3-minute radio single could have the complexity of a symphony and the emotional depth of a hymn. It legitimized pop music as an art form. It told the world that teenage music didn't have to be simple. It could be profound. And then, there is the personal verdict. The story of Brian Wilson didn't end in that bedroom. It took decades, but he eventually emerged from the darkness. In 2004, 37 years after he abandoned it, a revitalized Brian Wilson finally returned to the Smile material. He finished the Teenage Symphony. He toured it. He recorded it. And the world finally got to hear the context for Good Vibrations. When we look back at Brian's performances in his final years, before his passing in 2025, the effect remains spine-tingling. It ceased to be just a song about a girl long ago. It became a song about survival. It stood as a testament to the enduring power of that cosmic energy he chased in 1966. Now the lyrics, "I don't know where, but she sends me there," take on a final, poignant meaning. The music sent him to a place of madness, but it also eventually guided him home. Good Vibrations remains the ultimate testament to the studio genius. It is a perfect, crystalline moment in time where ambition, technology, and pure melody aligned. It captures the precise millisecond where the innocence of the early 60s met the psychedelic complexity of the late 60s. It is the sound of the sun setting on the California dream, casting a long, beautiful, and slightly melancholy shadow that stretches all the way to the present day. It reminds us that the greatest art often comes from the precipice, from the moment where an artist reaches just a little bit further than they should. Brian Wilson paid a terrible price for Good Vibrations, but in doing so, he gave the world a gift that will never stop echoing. He caught the wave, he rode it all the way to the shore, and he left us with the sound of the ocean. If you love these stories of musical obsession, of the thin line between genius and madness, and the secret histories of the songs that defined our lives, then you're in the right place. We are dedicated to unpacking the legends of music history, one track at a time. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into the archives. There are so many more symphonies to discover.